My name is Phil Kollin, and I'm the founder of a bourbon adventure company called Phil Talks Whiskey, and we host bourbon adventures of all shapes and sizes across the country. Where did my passion for bourbon begin? It's a better answer to say, where did my passion for whiskey begin? Because I've been drinking Scotch and Irish whiskey and Canadian whiskey for a long time. But it wasn't until I really started being exposed more to bourbon about 10, 15 years ago when people started putting pours of Maker's Mark and other Bookers and the Blantons and Buffalo Trace products and Wild Turkey products in front of me that I realized that it wasn't the whiskey so much I liked, it was specifically bourbon and those corn mash bills and those sweeter notes. And from there, it's been nothing but a journey straight up with my love of all things bourbon. The way to my whiskey journey was trial and error. I had a lot of things that left a bad impression, no impression, or a good impression. The first whiskey I can really remember knowing as a brand was Johnnie Walker Black. I can remember as a young man just out of college ordering that, putting down the Heinekens and some of the other, now in hindsight, Rolling Rock, the somewhat forgettable beers and switching to spirits. And I, tried a little bit of everything. I liked gin when I discovered not all gin has to be bad, and that there are some wonderful gins when you're not paying $3 for it in a mixed drink in a plastic cup the size of your head. But the more I sampled my way through different whiskeys, the more, with anything else, with all our preferences, it resonated more and it left a solid impression. So there were some Canadian whiskeys along the way and American whiskeys. But at the time, I didn't know the difference between Jack Daniels and Old Grandad. So it's been fun kind of, before I even got into professionally, having these moments. And one of them that I'll never forget is I first came to Louisville and we had some friends here. One of them coincidentally worked for Buffalo Trace, but that's not really related to the story. And we were at their house and they were bringing up bottles. And there were different things, some I'd had, some I hadn't. And my friend said, "Hey, you should try this." I said, "Oh, what is it?" He goes, "Well, it's got a funny name. It's called Elmer T. Lee." I said, "Elmer T. Lee, that's the name of a bourbon?" He goes, "Just try it." I said, "It's got the guy's face on it. That's hilarious." He goes, "Try it, you'll like it." This was about 10 years ago. And I loved it. And it was the first thing I had that was new bourbon to me that I'd not had before that left like this huge impression. It happened many times since then. But I remember my first pour of Elmer and I said, "Well, this is phenomenal. It's a little sweet. It's got a clean finish. It's a nice proof." And I often joke that was one of the worst things that happened to me because about 2 years after that, the bottles became impossible to find. Elmer T. Lee lived a nice long life, but he passed away. And I think that made the bottles even harder to find. But that was one of those moments where I had like a little whiskey love affair just at someone's kitchen counter in the middle of Louisville at 10 o'clock at night. All the distillers around the world have agents, whether it's the Kentucky Distillers Association, a guild in Scotland, a bunch of Irish guys doing Irish things, fighting to prove to you that their whiskey is superior. And to do that, they showcase what's different about it. And that's been what part of my own whiskey journey has been about, because the two things you often hear associated with Scotch whiskey and Japanese whiskey that you don't hear much of the other whiskeys is it tastes smoky and peaty. Smoky and peaty, smoky and peaty, because of the malted barley and the process they use. And that was a turnoff to me at first, but now I'm coming back around to celebrate that. And bourbon doesn't do the same thing. Bourbon talks more about rye versus wheat. You always hear rye is robust and wheat is sweet. And you hear the different grain combinations and the tweaks and changes. And of course now, a whole different layer, secondary finishing, even flavored bourbons, bourbon aged on boats. So I feel like they each try to show you what they're about in no uncertain terms to make them seem superior to different brands, whether it's Scotch, Canadian, Irish. But the bourbon industry wants to show you they're all of it. Something for everyone. The way I broke into the industry is that I've always enjoyed people and talking to people and showing people a good time and exposing people to things they may not know, sharing knowledge or sights or beautiful scenes with people. And a great way to do that when I first arrived in Louisville seemed to be hosting bourbon tours, taking people out to the heart of bourbon country and every 2-lane road, 4-lane road, no lane road, 1-lane road, and showcasing the beautiful parts of the state, the distilleries, the horse farms, and everything in between. And every day I did that, every new distillery I went to, every new person I spoke to, every new tour I took made me fall a little bit more in love with all things bourbon culture. So there's a lot to love about all things bourbon and working in bourbon. It's hard to say what one favorite part is. I love the history of all things whiskey culture. I love the lore and the legends and the larger-than-life figures. I love the business side, the multinational companies that run it, the small independent distilleries, the process of making it a science. But if there's one thing I love more about the bourbon industry and anything else, it's the people. And I know everyone says this, but there's so much to be said about the amazing people you meet and interact with, whether they're working in the industry, a fan of it, or just people who want to know more about bourbon. I was getting my hair cut the other day, and we were talking about what I did, and my barber goes, "Oh yeah, my uncle's been a plant manager at Jim Beam for 30 years. Really? Tell me more. Just yesterday, a guy said, "Hey, I have a photo I want to show you. My wife's aunt was trying to give her this bottle of 12-year-old sealed, very, very old Fitzgerald from 1962. Tell me more." So bourbon is an amazing way to bring people together, both inside the industry, fans, or people who are new to it. And I think the one thing I love about this gig, about having worked in bourbon for a while, is hands down the people. From the Freddie Johnsons all the way down to the guy who had his first sip of Woodford Reserve last week. I love whiskey history. I could spend hours sharing stories of whiskey history. Part of what was required of the job, when I was taking groups out on the bus, it's a long ride between downtown Louisville and Loretto, Kentucky, or Makers Markets. You gotta fill the time. And you wanna make sure you're telling stories that keep them awake, that keep them interested, and they're not gonna hear when they're at the distillery itself. So the more I dug into learning more about the history, reading great books like Bourbon Empire, and there's just scores others out there, the more I find myself with my jaw on the ground about these incredible intersections of American history and bourbon, and these amazing, larger than life, over the top, but incredibly real, colorful characters. It's an industry that goes back to George Washington, and you don't have to use much hyperbole to draw these big names into these people who have been distilling, selling, transporting, and in some cases illegally bootlegging whiskey. So it's a really easy connection to make with today's bourbon industry and all the history of American whiskey. And it's fascinating. I've got two favorite stories that I probably shared once too often, but one more time won't hurt. There was a time about 1815 where two of the most notable American historic figures, relatives of these figures, were in one place. And that was just outside of New Haven, Kentucky, where a gentleman named Waddy Boone, who was a cousin, second cousin, Boone family's huge, of Daniel Boone, he ran a distillery. And one of Waddy Boone's employees was Thomas Lincoln, who was the father of Abraham Lincoln. And there'd be days when Abraham Lincoln would walk the mile from his home at Knob Creek Farm and bring his father lunch. And as the story goes, Waddy Boone, relative to Daniel Boone, whose son, who was hired Thomas Lincoln, whose son was Abraham Lincoln, took one look at Abraham Lincoln and said, "Whatever that young man decides to do with his life, I'm sure he'll be great at it, whether it's distilling or otherwise," which is the perfect amount of malarkey in any bourbon. So no one looks at a 5-year-old and says, that man is gonna be great one day. But sure enough, all the records prove that Thomas Lincoln and Waddy Boone and Abraham Lincoln and Daniel Boone all have this shared connection. Another story I love is from Prohibition, because you can never have enough great stories from Prohibition. And there is a gentleman named George Remus, more famous in the Cincinnati area, but books have been written about this guy too. But he was smart and he was clever, and he bootlegged in a way where he wouldn't get caught. So he had a medicinal license which allowed him to own the warehouses that had the whiskey, and allowed him to move it from warehouse to warehouse, which you couldn't do otherwise. But he quickly realized he'd make a lot more money selling it as illegal booze than he would as medicinal spirits. So he would arrange for his own trucks to be robbed. He'd call the legitimate warehouse workers and say, "I need you to move a truckload from warehouse A about 8 miles down the road to warehouse B at 2 o'clock in the morning." And the drivers go, "Okay." And then they'd make the drive about 2 miles. They'd be cut off by 2 other trucks who happen to know exactly where they were. And the truck drivers say, just make it a one black eye and just get on with it and get on their way. So I love that George Remus was robbing himself in order to make more money. One of the biggest challenges in doing what I'm doing, and I think similar for anyone who's hosting presentations, giving bourbon trail tours, is the growth has been unyielding and never ending. I used to have trouble keeping up with bourbon brands. Now I'm having trouble keeping up with distilleries. And not only that, keeping up about what's new at distilleries. Who's expanding? Who's offering this product? Who owns this brand at this point in this time? So it almost feels like part of a full-time job in itself, keeping track of what's out there. And more importantly, what's good and what's worth celebrating and what's worth, talking about. You can't share every story and you can't talk about every brand, because just as there's not enough space on the shelf, there's not enough time in a presentation to hit all of them. So that's one of the challenges, is trying to keep up with what's new, stay on top of it, and be able to share the best and most accurate information with people. One of the most frequently asked questions, I could make a list of the 20 questions I get almost any time I do a question and answer session with in a presentation or something like that. And one of them is always, how long do you see this bourbon boom continuing? How much further will it go? And now people have been asking me that for 5, 6, 7 years now, ever since we've really been ever since Weller 12 disappeared from shelves, and we've been in the heart of a bourbon boom. And I think the answer comes from people smarter than me, and those are the people who are hired by the big distilleries to forecast and look at accounting and decide that, yes, it's worth it to put $120 million into 6 new warehouses. It's worth it to put $500 million into a distillery expansion or buy second rounds. It's worth it to pay $425 million for a large craft distillery just outside of Lexington. So, follow the money, and I think these people know that it's here for a while, and they're banking on it, and they have smart money, and they know where it's going. The other thing, I always have an allegorical story that paints the picture of how things are booming. And just recently, in December of 2022, Sotheby's had an auction for Pappy Van Winkle. And to be clear, the bottle that they were auctioning off was a 2008 Pappy Van Winkle Family Estate 23-year-old. The 2008 is important because that means it was distilled at Stitzel Weller instead of Buffalo Trace, which is important to some people. It ended up going for not $10,000, not $20,000, not $40,000. 2 people bid it up to $52,500. My God, who pays $52,000 for an American whiskey? People in the middle of a bourbon boom, that's who. So between all the expansion dollars being put into it and stories like those, and I hear another one of those stories every 3 weeks, I see no end to this. I'll let you know when I start seeing a crest over the hill, but it's not today. Isn't it funny how generational tastes shift in alcohol so often? In the early 1980s, wine coolers, California wines, light beers, that was it. That was the most popular thing. All dark spirits were just collecting dust, and it was the old man in the bar ordered. But now bourbon's booming, and it's been inclusive. Now, the drinkers were ahead of the industry, but everyone's catching up and getting on the same page. There's more women in bourbon than there ever have been before, and they all elements of it, and they are celebrated and incredible and doing remarkable things, and you sit down and talk to them, and they're passionate and intelligent about what they do. You've got now 2 African-American distilleries in the state of Kentucky, and even more minorities in different facts. So you have a history that is largely littered with white men in the bourbon industry. And you always talk about the Bourbon Hall of Fame, or if you were to make a bourbon Mount Rushmore, those historical figures from 100 and 150 years ago, but it's changing, and it's changing quickly, and it's reflecting the drinking habits of Americans. And hot damn, I hope that continues, because it's wonderful. Legacy, I don't know much about a legacy, but what I really like about my role is that there's so many great brand ambassadors out there, so many people representing distilleries, and they do a great job of telling the stories about their brands, about their history, about their influential characters. I'm hoping to fill a gap, a niche in several ways, and one of those is a lot of these distilleries that have been shuttered, lost to history, closed down, bulldozed over, kept in records, but not much more, stories written down. I want to be the one who helps share those stories, those that don't have an advocate or a bourbon brand behind them currently, because they're just as wonderful as the existing stories from everyone from, Booker No to Jimmy Russell. There's older stories out there that are a little bit on the back burner. So I love talking whiskey, and I love sharing these stories, and I want to connect people with what's out there today, certainly, but also share some stories about what might have been a little forgotten, because there's no one telling those stories in the same way as there are with the big brands. The business is called Phil Talks Whiskey because I really think the sky's the limit. I do love bourbon, but I love all things whiskey, and I hope to learn more and grow. And so Phil Talks Scotch, Phil Talks Irish whiskey, Phil Talks Canadian whiskey, Japanese whiskey. I see a time when I'm able to do tastings, not just around the country, but around the world, and can speak intelligently the same way I can about bourbon, about anything that's distilled from grain and aged a little bit. And that's a really exciting prospect for me. The only problem is I named my business Phil Talks Whiskey. So I guess if I hire anyone, they're gonna have to be named Phil. Any Phils in here now that wanna work for me? No? You can find me online. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Derby City Phil. I say the witty things on Twitter. I post the pretty pictures on Instagram. Phil Talks Whiskey. I would love to host a bourbon adventure for you. There's a guy walking down the street, and he's in his neighborhood, and he sees a dog chained up in the yard, and there's a sign next to it, and it says, "Talking dog for sale, $10. He gets a skeptical look. He looks around, no one's there. He goes, "I'll bite." "What's the deal, dog?" And to his shock, the dog starts saying, "Well, my owner found out I could talk. I was immediately enlisted into the CIA, where I spent the next 15 years being airdropped into world leaders' headquarters, where I'd pose as a quiet pet, listening to their secrets, and then reporting back so we could have all the intelligence we needed around the world." The guy is shocked. He can't believe he's hearing any of this. He can't help himself. He runs to the front door. He finds the owner of the dog sitting in a couch. He goes, "What are you doing selling that talking dog for $10? And the owner goes, "That goddamn dog's a liar. He hasn't done half the shit he says he's done." That's my talking dog joke. So there's no shortage of bourbon stories out there to tell. And one that, for whatever reason, doesn't get told down at Maker's Mark, but I think it is the epitome of iconic Kentucky meets iconic Kentucky. And Bill Samuels Jr. will tell you this is true. When Colonel Harlan Sanders was starting his business as the KFC franchise, and his goal was to tow the fryer around to restaurants and tell them how to make chicken his way and then sell it for like a quarter or a nickel. He got proceeds on the sales of it. He happened to be down in Southern Kentucky, and he was friends with Bill Samuels Sr. And he talked about his plans to start this whole idea of what would eventually become Kentucky Fried Chicken. He said, "But it's hard. I've got to drive and fill out the paperwork and hitch up the trailer to the back, and I could use a hand." And Bill Samuels Sr. pointed to his son, Bill Samuels Jr., who of course is the president emeritus of Maker's Mark and brand ambassador and wonderful personality. And he said, "Bill over here turns 16 next month. He'll do it." And to which Bill said, "What? I'm doing what? What's happening?" And they spent a summer traveling Kentucky with Bill at the wheel, handling the heavy lifting, the hard work, and Colonel Sanders handling the selling and the paperwork for the restaurants. And if you look in the records, the first KFC employee is Bill Samuels Jr. So you've got one brand that went on to be an internationally known, iconic chain restaurant, and another that became one of the most well-known bourbon brands of all time. And they had their origins about at the same spot. And I love that story. This is one I don't break out often, but I love it. This is my Kermit the Frog seeing if his order of Colonel Taylor came in. "Yes, Kermit the Frog here. I was just seeing if my bourbon is available." "No? No? Maybe tomorrow?" "Well, you don't have it, that's okay too." "All right, thank you. Cheerio." That was bad. But it's so good it's bad. Or so bad it's good.